When you're reporting on stories the police won't like, how concerned should you be with your personal safety?
There could easily have been a scenario where officers say, "Look, we'll let you walk on this," as opposed to being incarcerated. But you go mess up that white guy.
That's Jamie Kalven, journalist, human rights activist, and founder of one of Chicago's newest Pulitzer Prize winners, the Invisible Institute. It's just the latest in a long string of achievements in an award-winning journalism career that has, among so many other things, literally transformed Chicago's police department. I'm Charlie Meyerson with Rivet 360 and ChicagoPublicSquare.com, and this is Chicago Media Talks, a show in which people in Chicago media talk about Chicago media. We're recording this live on Clubhouse before turning it into a podcast. And if you're listening live, we'll be taking your comments and questions. Just tap the raise your hand icon at any time. Here's my co-host, my friend, my Rivet colleague, journalism strategist, Sheila Solomon.
Jamie, welcome and congratulations to you and your staff on that big prize.
Thanks, Sheila. It was really unexpected. We had reason to believe that we were a finalist for the audio reporting category, but to win in the national reporting category was just an utter shock and surprise. Still processing.
Well, you're sharing the award with some other newsrooms, so tell us about the stories that led to this award.
Yeah, so the award for national reporting is a byproduct of a collaboration with principally the Marshall Project and a couple of other local nonprofits, looking at the use of police dogs essentially as weapons. So I think one of the things that, and it's been commented on, that makes this particular award a kind of a benchmark is, it was a national local collaboration of nonprofit journalism newsrooms, with obviously the Marshall Project being the big national partner. And the other finalists in that category were the staffs of the New York Times and the staffs of the Wall Street Journal. So, I wouldn't for a moment want to suggest that nonprofit newsrooms like ours are the future of journalism in the sense of saving journalism. But I think this marks a moment of recognition that they are an integral and essential part of the emerging media landscape. So that's fascinating. The other category in which we were a finalist was for our podcast series, Somebody, which I urge the audience to check out if you're not aware of it, which also marks a kind of a departure in how investigative podcasts work. It's the investigation of the murder of a 22-year-old young man in Chicago, and Courtney Copeland, and the host and protagonist and voice of the podcast is not me, not one of my colleagues, not an investigative journalist, but Courtney's mother, Chaparral Wells. And so, again, an interesting departure in, a practice that's been very much part of the history of the Invisible Institute, and just trying to think hard about what our relationship as journalists is to somebody else's story. So, one way of putting it is in the podcast, we sort of centered the source, but we don't really think of Chaparral as a source. She was a colleague in producing the podcast. So, and it's an interesting moment in journalism, and we're proud and gratified to be part of it.
Back to your reporting on police dogs. How might you summarize that for our listeners?
Well, that there are, just as a statistical matter, a shocking number of police dog bites. On suspects, on civilians. And it's an area, think of the work that's been done on police shootings, think of the work that's been done on use of tasers, think of the work that's been done on excessive force. This is a mode of state violence that had eluded that kind of scrutiny. So, and one of our partners was the Indianapolis Star. And again, as gratifying as the awards are, and they are, and of course they're incredibly helpful in building an organization, building visibility, leveraging resources. They really are a byproduct. And the metric we care about in our work is impact on policy and practice. And in Indianapolis, which had an abysmal record in terms of the number of bites of number of civilians bitten by police dogs, there was immediate change in policy, in the police department and the city council. So, this is one of the things that characterizes our work. So we're not, the Invisible Institute is not a media outlet in itself. We have robust partnerships, above all with the Intercept for national publication of our local reporting. But we're not in the posture of competing for attention with, essentially redundant content, which is the way a lot of journalism works. Everybody competing over the same story. And so our focus, and what I constantly, raise as a criteria with colleagues, is we want to be doing stories that won't get done if we don't do them. The Invisible Institute actually grew out of a really aggressive FOIA practice. So
we should explain, that's Freedom of Information Act request.
Pardon that. Yeah.
No, that's okay.
That insider, Freedom of Information Act requests. And for, over close to a decade, we pursued one case in which I was ultimately the plaintiff that in 2014 culminated with a decision of the Illinois Appellate Court holding that documents bearing on allegations of police abuse are public information in Illinois. And, all sorts of things have flowed from that.
On behalf of journalists everywhere, thank you for that. That's been a gift to the public and to journalism.
Yeah, and what I wanted to emphasize is that we've continued, continue to aggressively use FOIA and look for different lines of inquiry. And so looking at police dogs was something, we were doing, and we're doing in jurisdictions around the country in a kind of exploratory way. And that's what really drove the reporting. Whereas most of our reporting, comes out of, especially in my case, being deeply, deeply, deeply immersed in Chicago, particularly the South Side, and kind of well-sourced in our environment. But with FOIA, we cast a wider net.
The diversity of this year's Pulitzer winners kind of stood out for me, including the fact that a teenager has been recognized with a special citation. But a lot of people of color seem to have gotten awards this year as opposed to years past. Now, is that my imagination?
I think it's true. I think that, the Pulitzers were delayed by the COVID conditions we've all been dealing with. I think this was a year of kind of reflection for everybody, including the Pulitzer judges. And there's no question that the sort of historical moment, the zeitgeist in terms of whatever we're going to call this era, the post-George Floyd moment, was really dramatically reflected in the Pulitzers. And, I don't follow these things closely, but my impression has always been that the Pulitzers are kind of the ultimate journalism establishment award, right? And I think this year was a departure from that. And whether they've broken the mold for the future or it was just in response to, this particular moment in our common life, we'll have to wait and see. But I had some, particularly around the podcast, I had some interaction with judges. They had, in the run-up to the announcement, they had some specific questions about how we'd gone about the podcast. And I had a conversation with Stephen Engelberg, who's the former New York Times editor, who's now the executive editor of ProPublica. And, he was very positive about the reporting but did reflect this is a new mode of journalism, a new way of approaching stories. So I think, like all of us, they're trying to be responsive to and sort of grappling with changes in the in how these stories are reported. And if you add Chaparral Wells, who is not a conventional journalist, the host and voice of the Somebody podcast, to the young woman who took the George Floyd video, there's also a sort of acknowledgement of, I don't really like the term citizen journalism, but that journalism is a practice rather than a status. And I think that's really healthy.
Let's back up. Why is it called the Invisible Institute?
So it really, it's turned out to be a very appropriate name in ways we can talk about, but it started as a joke. So, way back, we're talking now 1999, 2000, I had for a number of years been immersed in high-rise public housing on South State Street, principally at Stateway Gardens, to some degree at the Robert Taylor Homes and Ida B. Wells. And I was there. I had multiple roles. I was finishing a book on an unrelated topic, so I wasn't really reporting out of that environment. And when I finished my book, it's about 2000. And the so-called plan for transformation is getting rolling. Really, the precipitous demolition of high-rise public housing and the forced relocation of residents, an extraordinary phenomena at the center of the city that was by no measure being adequately covered by major media. And so I started to report from a vacant unit at Stateway Gardens about we created an online publication, The View from the Ground, and my wife, Patricia Evans, is a documentary photographer, and there was a young college student who'd sort of attached himself, named David Eads, who it's kind of a wonderful story, worked for several years with me, was a kind of tech genius and helped with the production side of The View from the Ground. He then went on to the Tribune, to NPR, to ProPublica, the Chicago Reporter, and ultimately was part of the team at the Marshall Project that won the Pulitzer with us. So anyway, we're hunkered down in a vacant unit in a public housing high-rise. If you'd come to visit me there, you would have been ushered in very graciously, I should add, by guys who were dealing drugs outside our office. And when we launched The View from the Ground with the first reporting, as a kind of sort of gentle thumbing of my nose at academia, at think tanks, I said that the View from the Ground was being published under the auspices of the Invisible Institute, and people just really liked the name. I feel like the name kind of just followed me around for years. Kind of loosely describing a set of collaborations and associations. And then after we won the lawsuit, Kalven versus Chicago, in 2014, it was a sort of pivotal moment for what had been a loose collaborative ethos, which is actually where I'm most comfortable. And the feeling that really to be worthy of this, now sudden access, the walls of official secrecy having fallen, we had sudden access to information nobody had ever had before, that we really needed to kind of institutionalize, staff up, become a proper nonprofit organization, at which point we actually became the Invisible Institute. But it all started with a wisecrack.
And how many other journalists make up the staff?
So there's a core staff at the moment of 8, but then, nobody at any given moment, we refer to it as sort of the core team, fully salaried staff. And, but on, a number of different projects, we work with either partners, as with the Marshall Project, or with contractors in the sense of people we pay on a project basis. So and there are a number of people. So I couldn't hazard an exact number at the moment, but so we're a relatively small nucleus, and then really far-flung web of collaborators and partners, some of whom are on the payroll and some of whom, work with us on an in-kind basis. So, from the start, part of my vision has been to build capacity through collaboration, and it's worked out pretty well. So we have, it's now, close to 20 years. We've worked very closely with the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School, so that at any given time, we have a clinical professor, a civil rights lawyer, and as many as 6, sometimes even more, law students working with us within the curriculum. So it's kind of like having a small law firm attached to us. So a lot of our work is kind of that way. But the core is a relatively small team. Each of whom have some measure of organizational responsibilities, but also everybody's a creative.
Coming up, how dangerous is it for journalists to piss off the cops?
Chicago Media Talks is sponsored by Sun Fun U Mediterranean Voyages. When you need a break from all the news and from the windy city itself, join Sun Fun U for a week yachting through the Mediterranean, learning history of the region and playing in the sea. To make trouble seem a world away, visit Sun Fun U and sign up for a voyage this summer.
As the Invisible Institute's Jamie Kalven's more recent work has come into the spotlight, a lot of people may not have been aware of one of his most personal connections to crime in Chicago. In 1988, his wife was beaten and sexually assaulted while running along the lakefront. Jamie, how has that shaped your journalism, shaped your career?
Wow, that's a great question, and one that I may not have an adequate answer for. So I wrote about 2 years after the assault, and my wife, Patricia Evans, as I said, is a photographer, close colleague. At the time, we had 2 children, 4 and 8 years old, and the image I used for the condition we found ourselves in after she was brutalized was as if we were shipwrecked in the midst of everyday life, and particularly acute, obviously for her, but also 2 small children, each in their own way, trying to make sense of something that had sort of capsized the household. And I ended up was in close collaboration with my wife a couple of years after the assault, undertaking a book that was later published in 1999 titled Working with Available Light. The title, both a gesture towards my wife's photography and an expression of what I think was really important in the whole undertaking, understanding that I couldn't fully grasp her experience. So in a way, it was a book in praise of partial knowledge, of what can be known of other people's condition in life. And it really was, work on the book and the conversation, the deep conversation with my wife that actually, continues, had a profound effect on my work more generally, in a couple of ways. But I'm groping a little bit for language, because I hope someday to be wise enough and a good enough writer to actually take this on and give a fully adequate account. But I think the two things I can identify, I touched on one of them. One is a kind of deference to other people's experience, not to assume you understand too quickly. And I think there's a kind of occupational hazard in journalism of just assuming things too quickly. And so it's always been a premise of my work, and reflected in, close to a decade and a half I spent immersed in public housing, that in order to have the conversations that we desperately need to have, in order to understand the issues and the stories that we're drawn to as journalists, we have to build the relationships to support those conversations. So the kind of parachuting in with a notebook and assuming that you have some competence that can access somebody else's story, somebody else's lived experience, I think is a blindness and a hubris in journalism. So that's one thing. The second thing, which really has profoundly shaped just how I conceptualize stories and try to find ways into them, is really what much was made of working with Available Life at the time as, a man writing about a woman's experience of male violence, of the violence of men. I understand that. But actually what I was engaged in as a writer, and what I was trying to do, was to trace the ramifications in across time and through relationships of a single act of cruelty and moral stupidity. And so that has been really central to my work, how violence ramifies, the long-lastingness of violence over time, how it shapes people's experience of the world, how it actually shapes the world, that we move through, and just how fundamentally conditions of violence and tolerance of violence, whether it's state violence or the threat of personal violence, diminishes the possibilities of human flourishing. So there has been this kind of dialectic at the center of my work between reporting out of the most, intimate space of my own life and my family life, and thinking about, conditions of violence in the neighborhoods and communities most directly affected by state violence, and by, our collective ability to really tolerate intolerable conditions for our fellow citizens.
Jamie's reporting on Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke's murder of Laquan McDonald contributed to, many things, but including the firing of Superintendent Gary McCarthy, led to federal investigations of human rights abuses in the Chicago Police Department, shattered then Mayor Rahm Emanuel's reputation. Jamie, as you've reported on stories the police won't like, how concerned have you been with your personal safety and the safety of people close to you?
Yeah, I don't want to sound cavalier about it, but so there have been different phases of my reporting, and probably the time where I was most at risk was when I was reporting out of public housing. I did get threats. I did get death threats from the police at the time. And, what would have happened had any of those threats been acted on? There's no way in which they would have come at me directly. But, somebody that they'd arrested and had leverage on, there could easily have been a scenario where officers say, "Look, we'll let you walk on this," as opposed to being incarcerated. But you go mess up that white guy. I find in doing, and again, I personally have a fairly high tolerance for risk, so I'm not talking prescriptively. I have just found it easier to do the work without being unduly preoccupied with those kinds of threats, and I'm still here. I think, I think it takes a different form now. I was working. I hope I was doing good work as a reporter, but I was working in relative obscurity in those years, and the city and the police were pissed at me, but my name was not on a marquee, right? And I think in recent years where there's been more acknowledgement of the work, where I have a more, for better or worse, a more prominent public role, it's hard to actually game out the any kind of rational calculus where it would make sense for anybody to, physically harm me. It's not clear what would be accomplished there. On the other hand, if it's just somebody who's being irrational and impulsive, there's actually not much you can do to protect yourself against that.
What counsel do you have for others reporting critically on the cops? People who are inspired by your work and want to take on the same kind of thing, but may not have, your profile at this point.
It's a hard question. I wouldn't recommend. I am hesitant to urge people to do the reporting without regard to consequences, because I think, you can be. We've seen reporters targeted and injured in some of the demonstrations, over last summer, particularly. So I don't want to minimize, the harms. I've actually found that cops live in narrative. They're incredible gossips. They live in stories. That's sort of the medium, at least in my experience. It makes it really rich and interesting to sort of cover the police. Some of my major sources, not least in the Laquan McDonald reporting, have been in law enforcement. And there's a sort of grudging respect for your reporting if you get it right. So, that operates. And my stance, I've actually had relations, I don't, with the current head of FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police. I've actually had relations with successive, heads of the police union, and with officers intensely, critical of my work or critical of the Kalven decision, the Freedom of Information Act decision. I guess the one thing I would say prescriptively is I don't think it's healthy to, and I say this as, a critic over many, many years of the police department, I don't think it's healthy to think of the police as being monolithic. I don't think that's good for our public discourse. I don't think it's good for thinking carefully and rigorously and inquiring effectively into the, deplorable conditions we find ourselves living in with respect to policing in the city at the moment. I think the police are, as individuals, are kind of inside they're inside the belly of the whale with the rest of us. And we need to find ways of approaching this immensely important and central story that sees the police as being, as individual police officers, as being kind of entangled in the mess that the police department has become over time, as the rest of us are as civilians. I don't know if that's helpful. I wouldn't over dramatize the danger. I actually think there is a tendency to over dramatize how dangerous police work is. And I think, outside of certain circumstances that are extraordinarily dangerous, I think, we can get a little overwrought about how dangerous journalism is. I think it's a job, and this is part of the job. I should add, though, that where I have, been most kind of retaliated against has actually not been by individual police officers, but it's been by the city. When I was reporting out of public housing, there's a series you can find on the Invisible Institute website called Kicking the Pigeon. It's a series of 17 articles about a rogue police crew that was operating at Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens. When I was in the course of reporting that, the city law office subpoenaed all of my notes with it having anything to do with drug dealing, police abuse. It was an incredibly wide subpoena in public housing at that time, and they pursued that subpoena, seeking contempt sanctions against me for a full 18 months. And I think there's no sense in which they actually wanted my notes. It was much more retaliation against a reporter for reporting that they were upset about. So that, I think that's a more serious and a more likely threat against journalists. I had a similar experience in the run-up to the Laquan McDonald trial. The defense team subpoenaed me to testify in an effort to get me to reveal my sources, and principally the source within law enforcement who had told me about the incident and about the existence of the videotape in the first place, and set me on the road in reporting that story. And again, it was a couple of months of being back and forth and in court, threatened with contempt, and all sorts of wild things being said in court, alleging that I had orchestrated the witness testimony and, had deliberately tried to, bring about the prosecution of Jason Van Dyke. So I think those things, which lots of journalists have experienced, the sort of institutional retaliation, is probably more of a concern than the personal acts of violence by individuals, or the threat of the same. And there, I think we have a real problem in journalism. I think we have, I've been lucky. The Laquan McDonald's a high-profile case. In the earlier instance, I was ultimately represented pro bono by Tom Sullivan, a former U.S. attorney, and had great legal representation. So I think that's a question for the profession. I mean, I think about when I was in the Laquan McDonald situation, I had great lawyers step up to represent me pro bono. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press provided support. There was a national petition of journalists. So I had tremendous support. I could have been a young, unknown reporter, maybe downstate, reporting on the school board or something else, found myself in a similar situation where I was, being on completely fictional grounds, being pulled into a lawsuit. That could be a terrifying experience. And I'm writing for a publication that is on life support and couldn't withstand even a frivolous lawsuit. So I think I would worry more about that than the personal threat. I think it's critically important that there be legal resources available to local journalists doing their jobs. And just think of all of the, local and regional newspapers and other publications that are one frivolous lawsuit away from bankruptcy. So anyway, I've digressed some, but I think that is a much more fundamental question for journalism.
My colleague, an award-winning reporter in her own right, and for purposes of this show, the producer of this episode, Jennifer O'Neill, has raised her hand, and she has a question, and I hope others will too. Jennifer.
When it comes to greater reform of the Chicago Police Department, and since listening to your last comments, perhaps even the city as a whole itself, what would you like to see happen next? I mean, in your opinion, what are some crucial next steps?
Oh, I appreciate the question, and it allows me to correct something that Charlie said in the setup about my reporting transforming the Chicago Police Department. I wish that were true.
Well, it transformed it a little bit, didn't it? Just a teensy.
Well, no, it caused a lot of turbulence for sure.
I call that transformation.
But the point is that it keeps the actual institution keeps producing the same terrible outcomes, and so I really appreciate Jennifer's question, and it is broad. I'll try to narrow it in a couple, just to give you a sense of a couple of things that I'm concerned about and trying to find words to create some perspective on. One is, I think, as a city, and I mean that, as all of us together, it's really time for a gut check as far as where we are in terms of reform, if that's the right word. Chicago had its George Floyd moment 6 years ago with the Laquan McDonald revelations, the cratering, as Charlie said, of the Emanuel administration. And, from that moment on, it has been sort of axiomatic in Chicago politics that police reform and / public safety is the highest priority in the city. We've had endless representations by police officers. We have a mayor who was swept into office on a reform agenda, that this was just the most urgent thing. And look where we are. Look where we are. There's certain things that have been achieved. I sometimes use the image of, swimming across a big body of water, and we're kind of in the middle and we can't see either shore. So it's hard to say, exactly where we are. But the critical metric is people keep dying unnecessarily. Lives continue to be diminished unnecessarily. People are denied freedom. All these things are avoidable. And if we're looking for, just a more granular sort of embodiment of that, the two most recent high-profile killings in Chicago by police officers, both of which I reported, Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old boy, and Anthony Alvarez, 22-year-old young man, both were shot at the end of frantic police chases. That initiated a public commotion, driven in part by the mayor, about the urgent necessity of changing the foot pursuit policy of the police department. Well, that the reckless nature of the foot pursuit policy had been diagnosed definitively in 2017 in the Department of Justice report on the Chicago Police Department. Had been recognized earlier, as a problem, and nothing had been done to address it until there were the back-to-back killings of these two young men at the ends of chases. That's just one of many, many examples of things that are fixable and haven't been fixed. And I think we should be ashamed. What we are talking about, we're talking about today, tomorrow, are avoidable deaths if we were to do the things that, we know how to do. We don't have to have some new insight or analysis of policing or technological innovation. And so, I'm feeling very strongly the failure of our political leadership, but also, in some sense of all of us, to push that agenda. And I think this relates to a second broader point. This is where I think we may be at the threshold of a more productive public discourse about these things. We've had, and I think it's really helpful, and it's created imaginative space that is important. We've had now years of discussion of abolition of the police, of a radical reimagining of law enforcement, the slogan "defund the police," a kind of utopic project of really thinking big about how we could reorder our relationships with one another and create conditions in which everybody in the city has an equal opportunity to flourish. I understand that dynamic. I feel it. I'm close to it. I've seen again and again people, and we saw massively during the George Floyd summer, people who come into contact with this issue maybe for the first time or with a greater clarity than ever before, and they see immense harms that are baked into the society, that go back to slavery, that deform our common civic life. And when you're awash with perception of that nature, it's completely understandable that people want remedies that are transformative, remedies that are commensurate with the harm. And, I wish it were the case that there were those transformative remedies, but, my experience has brought me to the conclusion that they're just not on the menu. They're not on the menu. But what is on the menu are any number of concrete interventions, changes in policy, changes in practice, changes in culture, different points at which it's possible to intervene. And my hope is that we will begin to see a movement, a kind of civil society energy that brings as much moral passion to those more granular interventions, none of them transformative in themselves, but hugely important in the aggregate. I mean, I think that's how systems and cultures change. And I often think in this context of Dr. King, Andy Young, and others, and, what they were masterful at was generating a narrative in which very concrete reforms had profound and inspiring meaning. So if you think back to Selma, when we think of Selma, just that one word evokes this extraordinary historical drama and embodiment of profound themes of racial justice. But Selma was about the Voting Rights Act. It was about it was about the poll tax. It was about literacy tests as bars to the franchise. And we haven't had that kind of discourse around transforming law enforcement. We don't have that narrative that helps us understand how critically important something, is seemingly minor or easily overlooked as. Just to use the example, we've been talking about foot pursuit policy. I think, that's what we need. And I think journalism has a contribution to make there. And I'm not sure that we've made it. So a lot of people perceive police reform, especially under the consent decree, the sort of federal blueprint that for overseeing the process, as a kind of bureaucratic process, as a sort of checklist of things. And I think it's anything but that. It's, this is a human rights struggle. And the essence of human rights work is to do what we can today to prevent harms that will otherwise occur tomorrow. So I think we've got some work to do.
Jamie recently announced she's stepping down from the executive director's role at the Invisible Institute. Jamie, what's next?
Yeah. So, one of the unexpected adventures of my life has been, I really never, expected to build an organization, and least of all one that in a sense grew out of my work and then has a life of its own, and, with a wonderful group of young, co-creators at this point. But one of the things that has happened is over time, as the organization's gained traction, extended its reach, taken on more projects, my role as executive director has involved, just more and more and more administrative and managerial work, and it has sort of taken me out of the as much the creative work as I would like to be involved in. So basically, I'm stepping down as executive director, but only in order to redouble my creative contributions, I hope. And I have, a number of reporting projects I'm working on, and look forward to just completely diving into. And it's interesting. I know there are reporters on this on this call, on this conversation, and it's I can turn out an op-ed piece. I can write an article about a police shooting, report it and write it while doing the administrative stuff on a day-to-day basis. What I can't seem to find the time for is the actual sort of immersion and thinking that go into figuring out a bigger project, and that's what I'm full of appetite for. And I hope that in the course of the summer we'll be announcing a successor for my position in the executive director role, but I'm not going anywhere.
Now that you are stepping down from your administrative role, just curious what you would like to see the Invisible Institute accomplish moving forward.
Oh, thank you for asking that. I think sometimes we're perceived as being we are a production company now. We've got the podcast that was a finalist for the Pulitzer. We did a documentary for Showtime on 16 Shots that won an Emmy. We did the reporting that won the Pulitzer. We have done a range. We've got the database. We've done a really fascinating project called 6 Durations of a Split Second that was a creation of a police shooting that occurred in 2018 that actually was an art exhibition as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So, it can look like we're this kind of all over the map sort of production company working in different media. The way I understand the Invisible Institute is we are a human rights / journalism organization that investigates state violence and impunity. And it's really the investigations at the heart of our work, which also includes the public document requests, contesting official secrecy, that really is the driver. And then, as we advance an investigation, we have this kind of, it's almost like a design studio or a narrative studio in which the question becomes, how do we best tell this story with available tools? And sometimes, I joke with my much younger staff that I'm essentially a 19th century novelist who wandered into this sort of brave new world, and my mode of reporting is almost invariably going to be sort of novella length, long form narrative reporting. But we did the podcast, and early on it occurred to me that the elements were there for that. Maybe that was the best way to tell this story. I've got another TV documentary project that I'm working on. So the primary thing is the investigation. The primary metric is actually having an impact. I always say on policy and practice, but what I really mean is ultimately an impact on the lived experience of our fellow citizens and neighbors in communities most affected. The awards don't mean anything if the conditions don't change, or if we don't contribute in some small way to that. But then there's this other kind of fascinating dimension that we're trying to better understand of how you tell the story. So with every project, it's a new question. How best to tell this story? And I would add one other thing, Jennifer, which is that at the beginning of my career, as a journalist, my father was a First Amendment scholar. I sort of came up with this very strong sense of vocation under the First Amendment. I sort of understood the job as rigorously and diligently reporting, bringing the facts and information back to my fellow citizens, and trusting that with solid information, people will make better rather than worse choices, that better policies will emerge. Absolutely nothing in my career has supported that premise. I have to say that, in truth, I think the problem of our time, and I'm putting aside sort of fake news, the alternative reality kind of phenomena, is that people can be, by any measure, well informed. Read the right books, maybe even write some of them, have the New York Times and other media sources, on their doorstep, literally or figuratively every morning, be dutiful about being well informed, and at the same time be profoundly, willfully ignorant of the conditions of life within walking distance of where they put their heads on the pillow. That to me is extraordinary. So how we manage to know things and not know them at the same time, how we live with conditions that cry out to be addressed, how we tolerate intolerable things, how we fail to see things that are in plain sight. That to me is the core journalistic problematic. So when we're thinking about how best to tell a story, it's not simply, how to convey information. God knows we're all sort of drowning in tsunamis coming at us all the time of information. The question is how to tell a story with that information in a way that breaks through into people's moral imaginations so that it matters. So I hope that, as I become not the kind of driving force, but a member of the team at the Invisible Institute, that way of approaching the work will continue. And I have some confidence based on, the extraordinary group of colleagues who've been attracted to the work that will happen. But yeah, that would be I think we have a direction, we have a trajectory, we have even something that almost warrants being called a methodology. So, I hope we continue to roll in that direction.
I'd like to welcome another colleague, Jesse Batend, an award-winning producer for Rivet. Jesse, what's your question?
When it comes to somebody, that particular podcast sort of helped me see, call it a blind spot in some of my own work, in that you described the host of the show, Chaparral Wells, as a partner. And that's very different from a lot of the long-form narrative investigative podcasts that have come before, where a reporter is typically at least assisting in telling a story. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and how you came to it, and perhaps why we don't see it more often?
Sure. Well, I hope we will see it more often. I hope that'll be one of the impacts of somebody. So the genesis of the project is that, by virtue of my role in the Laquan McDonald case, we have, and it was particularly true when Chaparral first reached out to us, we have a pretty robust tip line. So I, regularly get from family members, from people in prison, "Dear Mr. Kalven," letters, and it's quite heartbreaking because in so many instances you can't help. There's no way to sort of enter the story. We try to respond to everybody who reaches out. There's a young reporter who works with us who we got a Dear Mr. Kalven letter from a woman named Sheila Wells. My colleague spoke to her a couple of times on the phone and then said to me, Jamie, you really should meet this person. We spent about 45 minutes talking face to face, and she brought a stack of documents. She had, as you know from listening to the podcast, Jesse, from virtually the moment she learned of her son's death, she started to investigate it herself, learned how to make FOIA requests, used her iPhone to record interactions with the police. But she was, close to despair when she reached out to us and has told me since that if we hadn't responded, she was going to just, stop actively investigating and live with her grief and unanswered questions. And, after our conversation, our presentation, my response was to say, Ms. Wells, we will help in any way we can with the investigation on one condition, that you're the lead investigator, that you continue to be, a central part of the investigative team, which was the case. So, it was kind of in the DNA of the project that she was a partner from the start. And, I never thought of her as a source. And then, about a week or 10 days later, it occurred to me, I don't know where this is going. But it's compelling, and we should probably capture radio quality sound while we're working on the investigation. And so we did, but it was, but everything was again driven, and this was sort of a more granular version of my answer to Jennifer about how I see the future. Everything was driven by the investigation. That, we were really trying to learn what we could about the circumstances of Courtney Copeland's death. And then deep in the investigation, we realized we really did have the makings of a podcast. And, at that point, but it really flowed from the very inception of the project as an investigation. It seemed like we should try, and initially it was tentative, try to see if there was a way to have Sheila be the host and the voice. And you said something that implied this. That also entailed really bringing our skill set as journalists to support that process. So Sheila, we worked really, really closely with my colleague Allison Flowers, who was the lead creative on it, and with two wonderful radio producers, Bill Healy and Sarah Geiss. So they became a team working together. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but it really, it relates also to the diversity of our staff. So we have, by any measure, a really diverse staff, age, gender, race. And I have never once thought to myself, we need a woman in that chair, or a black person, in this position. The focus has been on how do we do the work? How do we do the kind of reporting that we're committed to doing? And with that approach, it becomes apparent who is best equipped to do the work. And, and so we've sort of opened up our thinking about how to do the reporting. We have another podcast in progress that has a similar structure to the Somebody podcast, where the principal voice is not a conventional journalist, but is somebody who has an extraordinarily deep and interesting relationship to the story. I think it's just it's a matter of you spoke of abolition before, and I think even though I would argue against a sweeping abolitionist vision. I'm really grateful for the imaginative space that advocacy has created to consider alternatives. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of something similar in journalism, journalistic practice. There's Rebecca Solnit, the essayist, has a formulation somewhere. I'm not sure I'm going to get it exactly right, but it's something to the effect that journalists need to remember that it's always somebody else's story. And no matter how well you tell it, no matter how much attention you may bring to it, it remains somebody else's story. So I don't think we have a template or a fixed answer, but that's the core value that we want to honor at the center of our work at the Invisible Institute.
Closing thoughts, Charlie?
Especially as legacy media, like most recently, and in the headlines, the Chicago Tribune, suffer this decline by 1,000 cuts. Words fail me as I try to express how much comfort I take in the work of these small but growing network of mostly digital journalism startups, and the growth and the growing impact of the Invisible Institute. Jamie is a great example. It gives me hope for the future of journalism. Your closing thoughts, Sheila?
Well, I think the Chicago Sun-Times has been showing that a really small newsroom can still do journalism that makes an impact. So I'm wondering what the public's going to notice about a smaller Chicago Tribune newsroom. Next week, we'll have a chance to ask former columnist Eric Zorn on Clubhouse. Jamie, closing thoughts.
In terms of the future of journalism in Chicago, I think there's always a bit of a danger that, and I say this with sympathy for many friends at the Tribune who have left in recent years, who are about to leave, but I think there's a danger in imagining, because of the economic stresses in journalism right now, that there was this wonderful golden age in legacy media. I've spent my career over now, I won't count the years, a long time. Over a long time, I have devoted myself to the stories that, some of them now celebrated, but to the stories that the Tribune and the Sun-Times didn't cover, left on the table, to the neighborhoods and the conditions and the communities that were underreported or badly reported. So, as much as it's important to recognize the genuine economic perplexities of how journalism works going forward. I think we should also take heart from the fact that I don't know quite how we all managed to do it, but I suspect there's never been a time when more quality journalism has been produced, and there's a wider variety of voices within journalism. I don't see that as collapse. I see that as progress, and and I think one final observation, which is that if anything, we suffer from too much news, just too much noise and information, coming at us. So I think some of the new forms that are evolving, and the new collaborations that are beginning to take hold may actually ultimately produce a healthier diet for consumers of the news. Anyway, I see no reason for despair, although I have deep sympathy for those who wagered their lives and their careers on the stability of legacy media.
Our guest on this edition of Chicago Media Talks, recorded live on Clubhouse, June 21st, 2021, has been Invisible Institute founder Jamie Kalven. His book is Working with Available Light, A Family's World After Violence. You can reach him at info@invisibleinstitute.com. The Institute's podcast is Somebody, You can find Sheila Solomon at sheila@rivet360.com. And I'm Charlie Meyerson. Join me for a roundup of the news around 10 weekday mornings at chicagopublicsquare.com. And be here again Mondays at 1 o'clock Central for more Chicago Media Talks. For Sheila Solomon, producers Jennifer O'Neill and Mike Hoffman, and everyone at Rivet 360, thanks for listening.
Chicago Media Talks is sponsored by Sun Fun U Mediterranean Voyages. When you need a break from all the news and from the windy city itself, join Sun Fun U for a week yachting through the Mediterranean, learning history of the region and playing in the sea. To make trouble seem a world away, visit Sun Fun U and sign up for a voyage this summer. Rivet 360 makes podcasting easy. Want help with your podcast? Visit rivet360.com.